Hey everybody. I'm here again at the garden. Because I'm a relatively new user of smartphones, I have to learn the ways in which the camera isn't like my eyes. And some of those ways are the result of a process that resembles some parts of evolution where the products people most like transform the technologies. The products that are most adopted and most celebrated, most used, transform the technologies we use to produce them, and photographs these days are an unimaginably profuse, perhaps lethally profuse commodity. So the camera does things my eyes don't do. I don't want to leave the caterpillar on the cement, even though my interfering with it at all has consequences I cannot predict, right? Perhaps it knows precisely where it's going and when it's going, and perhaps it would have been fine had I not interfered with it. Perhaps now that I've changed its course, its life will be different. It seems, in fact, it must. And one of the things I think we often find each other doing is either trying to understand how to adjust our own course, or trying to adjust the courses of others, some of whom we may not actually have any relationship with at all. And these days, proximity adjusts courses, and whether or not people are wearing masks, and all kinds of strange, suddenly important aspects of our common daily experience change our courses. I used to, a long time ago, I made a story about a guy who doesn't really like that plant. It's okay with this one though. Maybe. I think it does like this one. Well, don't just start eating it. I mean, climb off the vehicle. There we go. Okay, so I got the insect off. I got the larva off the cement, and it seems actually that it's eating this plant. So I must have done kind of a good job. But I did change its course. And who am I to think that I know where it should be to such a degree that I'm going to redirect it in a way that will change where it is in every future moment of its life? Who am I to decide? A long time ago, I made a story about an insane, a kind of a schizophrenic person who believed that license plates were talking to him and that he could divine the future. by watching the relationships between license plates, car colors, and traffic lights. And so he would go every day to this corner to read the future of everything and its history and everything important from these abstract patterns that appeared in relationships he could observe and analyze in some bizarre, extremely uncommon way. But traffic lights change where we will be in the future. Every time we drive, we submit ourselves to mechanical orientation. When we use computing technologies and smartphones, we submit ourselves to mechanical orientation, mechanical input, mechanical stimuli. And some people will say, well, all stimuli is mechanical. No, it isn't. The movement of these leaves through the movement of the breeze through these leaves is, in my view, amechanical, in that it is not, well, it does get complex since there are so many machines, but the wind isn't made by machines. Influenced, perhaps. And in our time, to maybe a greater degree than ever previously. My point, though, is that the rhythms that are mechanical are unhealthy and non-organismal. They're too regularized. They're rectangles. They're choppy. They're chopped off. And they're not based on relationships. They're based on abstractions. And those are uninhabitable for living beings. There's a beautiful story by Larry Niven in which a man is in a spacecraft that has malfunctioned in such a way that he's going to be dragged into a neutron star, which is a particularly metamassive kind of black hole-like construct in physics. And anyway, he's out in the great beyond, a trillion miles from home. His cryosleep unit is maybe broken. I'm paraphrasing the story. And he's gonna die, and he knows it. And he sees this giant being, like a humanoid-looking being, approaching him in space. And the being essentially captures his ship, and he goes unconscious, and he wakes up on a park bench in New York in the neighborhood in which he was born. And as he's sitting there reflecting on what has just happened to him and trying to understand the motivations of the being who so expertly and correctly divined his nature, which sun he belongs to in the entire universe, right? Which solar system, which planet, but not just which planet, which country, which city, which neighborhood the park he played in when he was a kid, okay? And he's marveling that there's some being out there in the universe that not only was motivated to take the trouble to redirect his course, which certainly would otherwise have been fatal, but was successful too, with such an incredible degree of articulate perfection. And as he's thinking this, he notices that there's a bunch of pedestrians walking back and forth in front of the bench he's sitting on. And a child walks up and takes a caterpillar from that path with all the busy adults who would certainly have crushed it otherwise, and gently places it on the leaf of a plant that creature actually lays eggs on and nests on and makes their chrysalises on. And the man suddenly has a flash of insight and thinks, wow, that being that did that probably wasn't an adult of its species. That the being that saved him was a child, and what might have happened to him had instead an adult passed nearby. Now, I got lucky with the caterpillar, I think, but because I cannot see into time, I cannot tell truly whether my rescue, my seeming rescue of some organism or creature, turns out well or not. There's an old parable where, not sure if I should tell this story, but I think I will since I've started. There's an old parable where, and parables are a vehicle for understanding, right? They're like, now that's a metaphor, it's an analogy, but, or actually it's probably more truthfully a simile, but we usually use the word metaphor to point at parables. But a parable is a vehicle that gives us, under the right conditions, can endow us with insight that would otherwise be very difficult for us to obtain. And this is why it's profoundly useful for those of us who learn the skill to produce analogies rather than descriptions. Analogies and metaphors are far more instructive than descriptions generally. Partially because they're available to multiple layers of our feelings and imaginations and intelligences. And that multi-layered aspect is much deeper and richer and more like our minds, less like our cultures. Our cultures use metaphors to represent things, flatten them, tokenize them, turn them into commodities, make sure everybody gets one that'll fall apart soon enough that they'll need another one soon. That's not the only thing our culture does, but it's a common game around here. In any case, there's a story where a rabbi has an acolyte with him, and the rabbi has explained to the acolyte that they may travel together, but the acolyte is not to interrupt him or speak until later when they're sitting down at the fire while they're out in the world. And they're out in the world, and they're near a river, and in the middle of the river, a boat has turned over, and a family is scrambling to rescue each other. And an infant floats by the rabbi and his acolyte, and the acolyte says something like, "Save the baby," and the rabbi says, "Remember your agreement." And so they go on, and at night they're at the campfire, and the acolyte says, "Why, you're an evil man. Why didn't you save the baby?" And the rabbi said, "The reason that I've asked you not to speak and only to observe is that you cannot yet see into time. And since you cannot see into time, you cannot understand whether saving the baby is good or not. In this case, it was not good. If that baby had grown up, terrible catastrophes would have happened, millions of people would have been tortured, would have been very bad. I did not kill the baby, but neither did I have to save the baby." Now, this is a very kind of extreme example, and perhaps I've paraphrased it poorly, but the point is simply that I myself cannot tell. I do not know the future, and what seems good to me in the moment can be very confused, and part of the reason why it can be confused is that the frameworks I am using to make determinations are largely rule-based. Some of them emerge from feelings, but rule-based systems are not good enough to deliver the richness and depth of our humanity to us, and they're catastrophically deceptive when we don't understand their limitations or we take them as, well, that's the only option on the table. It isn't. Guidelines are more interesting to me than hard, fast rules. I was just talking with a young friend of mine on the East Coast about topics related to the current conversations around racism and call-out culture and genderism. There's a creature here. It's making noises. Hummingbirds. Complex issues that are currently being prosecuted in the media. And we've had a number of discussions on these topics, and one of the things that I said was that if you can't find answers to your question and you're feeling really frustrated and confused, try reforming the question. Or it may be that the perspective from which you have formed the question is not yet advanced enough to produce good results. So try some other perspectives. Now, the actual topic that I had imagined speaking about today is the relationship between seekers and vehicles. I want something, I'm going to use something to pursue this thing I want. Whether it's food or a relationship of some kind or money, status, insight. Maybe I just have big questions, right? I want to know, why are we born? What is death? What is light? What is time? Really, what are they really? I don't want to know what the humans know. I want to know what people far advanced beyond my peers know. I need to know. I'm not satisfied with reading books because that won't help me anyway. Most of the stuff that's worth actually understanding deeply, it has to be experienced. Oh my God, that was the craziest thing that just happened to me. 2 birds flew right at the back of my phone and split, and one went by my right ear and one went by my left ear. 2 hummingbirds. Oh, there they are. There they are again. Wow, that was really something. Kind of thing that only happens outside, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. You don't want to know about that secondhand, right? It's not interesting really to know that in a secondhand way. What's interesting is to have felt the thrum of their wingtips on the index finger that I'm using to hold the back of this hand. Oh, here's a guy I know. I met this guy yesterday. I saw this particular blue jay. I saw him uncache a peanut and eat it. I recognize him firsthand. I don't recognize him because I know he's a blue jay. He is a person I know. He is a personated blue jay for me because we've had experience together. And most of the stuff that is worth knowing about life and death and time and issues that deeply matter to us, most of these things are worth knowing firsthand. We don't have them as abstract knowledge. In the same way that a girl who has kissed me knows something about me that is unknown to any other being, even other beings who have kissed me. And I with a girl and someone who's eaten a piece of fruit, right? You can't, there's no description for a kiss, right? There's an entire library of forms of knowledge and understanding and insight that depend not on intellect, but on intimacy. And in our culture, The seekers are sold phony vehicles for waters that don't exist, and then expected to somehow use, float these boats on counterfeit water that makes them dumber every time they progress, because they're progressing toward complicity with abstract fictions, and they're not progressing toward intimacy in actual relationships. And it's really easy to talk about these things from my position, right? Except that you will notice that even while I'm making a video, while I'm making a representation, I have enfolded in that process moments of intimacy with the caterpillar, with the hummingbirds, with the blue jay, with these trees, with this place, with my footfalls. I'm not perfect. Some of my knowledge is abstract, and some of that knowledge is useful in domains where abstract knowledge is useful. And I'm curious abstractly. I'm curious theoretically. But what I really want is the knowledge that comes from intimacy. And that will mean, for me, that I will generally prefer vehicles that result. Vehicles that are likely to result in that kind of knowledge. Now, one of the things we do as humans, one of the things we often do, sometimes do, is we shop for vehicles off the shelf. So, for example, people may join a political party. They might join an environmental group. They might join an army. They might join a corporation. They might join another human being in a love relationship, or in a relationship of creative development, or intellectual development, or vocational development, or even just to accomplish a task like move one's home. We form these little vehicles of the moment, and people might join religions. Right? There's actually books that are supposed to tell you what everything is and what it's for and what you're supposed to do with it. And these are vehicles. And our language is a vehicle, or an array of processes, but we can think of it as a vehicle, that pre-directs certain aspects of our expectation and attention and desire, focus, purpose, activity, behavior. Language can be understood as a vehicle for verbal cognition, right? Conceptual cognition. And in this sense, mathematics is also a vehicle. Though again, I'm using the word analogically or metaphorically. But we like to start out with vehicles, and not everybody's as sophisticated as everyone else, and not everybody's as clumsy as everyone else. And so each person is going to find sort of a different way of being in the world, given the vehicles they're used to employing and have been rewarded for previously employing, and not punished for employing, or sometimes people go after the vehicles they get punished for employing. My point, though, is that as seekers, we're likely to acquire vehicles. I started out believing fundamentally in science. I then came to have some kind of sort of wishy-washy metaphysics. I then became, after a strong conversion experience with a man named Granville Oldham, I became a Christian, but I could not really be with the Christians because my mind was too different from theirs. I then began to experiment with Zen. I studied Buddhism without becoming a Buddhist. I had various experiences with what people might refer to as shamanism. Notice that as the story is proceeding, you'll see that I'm trying on different vehicles, and we could think of them as costumes or, badges or whatever you want to think of them. You don't have to think of them as vehicles, but I was seeking for knowledge. I wanted the intimacy kind, not the thinky kind. I wanted the direct experience, right? If there's something divine going on, I want to experience that. So I'm going to try the vehicles that people associate with that experience, since I'm not sure how to make my own boat yet. And as I proceed, I may shed them, or like molts, right? This is an idea that arose between me and another friend with whom I've been talking. My point, though, is that we don't want to... Well, some people are going to naturally find a vehicle and just crystallize into it, right? And that person will be, for example, I don't know, an Episcopalian their entire life, or an evangelical Christian, or a Muslim, or a Hindu, or an Advaitist, or a Zen student, or whatever they pick. And others will mix and match, and some of these vehicles are more vehicular than others, right? A couple of the vehicles I mentioned are actually sort of there to make you see through the vehicle. Meditation practices often have a quality like this, or can. But essentially, most of us, I think, hope to use the vehicle briefly, and then to exceed it, right? To exceed the protocols of the mission, right? To go beyond, and thus find ourselves in a real relationship with real risks and dangers and opportunities and benefits and so on. Not that we need to think of it like an accounting game. We don't. But I just mean that we go from abstract representations of vehicular-like processes, beliefs, and relationships. Hopefully, we use that as a launch pad, right? And we leave that behind. That's like the first stage of a 9-stage rocket, even though I'm not so fond of the mechanical metaphor. A metaphor I would prefer is that of the instars of a praying mantis, right? Starts out this tiny little creature and becomes something powerful enough to scare the crap out of a grizzly bear and make it run away squealing. And it does that by going through molts, right? It has 7 of what we call instars, and it sheds its skin. Each time it sheds its exoskeleton, and each of those sheddings is an encounter with death, and it sort of leaves its old vehicle, the external skin of it anyway, behind, right? And each time it gains new abilities, the mantis. I think on the sixth instar, most mantises gain working wings. It's an interesting transformation of the vehicle. And this can be seen as metaphoric for something that happens to humans. But my primary point is just that I think an intelligent relationship with vehicles really begins by realizing their limitations, their proper scope of application, right? I don't do math to figure out if I like the girl. And there are domains of intellectual understanding where logic is insufficient. You need something more than mere logic to tell you to orient and navigate in the terrain. Science doesn't tell us what stuff is, right? Or even really what it does. Science is an array of methods and acquired heuristics and perspectives, many of which will be proven to have been fallacious in the future, or will be integrated into much broader and deeper systems the way Newtonian physics was integrated into. It wasn't invalidated by relativity. Relativity just gave it like a whole new context to be understood within, and within that context it was reasonable at one order of perspective. So as we develop, and particularly as we get that deeply experiential knowledge that intimacy and relationships with light and life and time and death and questions and aspirations and so on. As we proceed and we adventure, hopefully, we live our lives, we don't just think them. As we live our lives and we make choices and we embark on projects and developmental, agendas. We may have cause to shed the vehicle we previously trusted. Or in some cases, we will simply realize, oh, that's a really good vehicle for this particular domain or this scope of an issue, but it stops being useful when I'm trying to understand like the origins of what's going on or the extended anatomy, or I'm trying to really gain a crucial insight that from inside the system of my vehicle I am blind to, right? It's obscured, sometimes by the very structure of the frameworks we are using to see, or the perspective we have chosen, or the purpose that caused us to turn our attention toward a given topic or situation. And often we adopt these frameworks and purposes from others, prefab, and with those adopted frameworks and purposes, just if we were to say go around picking up furniture from people's houses, right? Sometimes, I have tripped over this thing 5 or 6 times, and usually I'd be much more aware of my footfalls, but for that I am making a video. When we adopt stuff, it often comes with like shit you don't want, right? It comes with toxic predispositions, contagious, intentional misapprehensions, biases, prejudices. In other words, often when we adopt vehicles, the perspectives from which they were forged are not liberal enough to grant us the kind of advancement we hope to make by deciding to get in the boat, so to speak. The great promise of vehicles is developmental efflorescence, right? To rapidly and effectively and beautifully and rewardingly develop. And we want things like companionship and joy and fellowship, even though, I get that it's a gendered adjective. And notice that, the word relationship, right? There's this idea inherent primarily in English. The metaphors aren't the same in every language. But in English, a relationship is understood generally to be a journey. But it's also understood to be a vehicle. So you can say, like, are we gaining altitude, right? We've been going along for a long time now. The terrain has grown tedious, or whatever it is, whatever sort of observation one might be inclined to make. But lots of them will include language that is from traveling in vehicles. And some of the prefab vehicles are decent, and we don't, some of them are kind of obligatory. Mathematics, no one's likely to reforge the foundations of math, though, discoveries could be made that might have that effect. And those are some of my favorite kinds, actually. I like really staggering discoveries that sort of overwhelm the field and completely reestablish a new perspective. I find that kind of thing really exciting. But again, I strongly prefer intimacy to intellect. In a way, I adore intellect. I'm an intellectual. But I think of myself anyway as a heartful intellectual, and I want my heart to lead and my intellect to serve, rather than my intellect to dominate and my heart to occasionally get a word in edgewise, which is a lot more like what goes on in the bizarre situations we find ourselves in modern culture and society. Something untrustworthy is dominating, and occasionally our heart, gets a word in edgewise if we're lucky, or if we're unlucky. Sometimes that's the last thing that happens to people. But the vehicles are not, it's important to be able to be aware that we're using vehicles or something similar, to understand the analogy, right? That as seekers we often employ vehicles, and other people do, and some of that behavior looks very naive to us because they're using vehicles that we've long ago surpassed. Again, we can't expect everyone to be at the same place in the journey, or even be on the journey for the same reasons, or be looking for the same outcomes. Some people are more interested in comfort than development. It's the diversity of the players in the game is so staggering that you can't say, there are no simple rules about it. But what you can see happening is something not dissimilar to the politics of fungal blooms or algal blooms or bacterial blooms. You'll see in some population, right, a couple little sparks, and then pretty soon everyone's using the same language and yelling at each other back and forth about some topic related to whatever controversy they decided to pick out for troublemaking. And so it'll start like with a couple of little sparks, and then suddenly the whole mob is pulsing with this, what I refer to as a thrisp. But it can just be an idea or a agenda, right? A framework, a vehicle of thinking. And I suspect that most of the vehicles we're using in public, in common discourse, in an attempt to understand or transform issues that we are concerned about in our societies, those vehicles are not only garbage, they are addictive, they are kind of crudely compelling without actually having substance. They're not substantive. And they result either in a lot of wasted effort or in exacerbating the problem that they seemed to originate to ameliorate, right? And we should notice when this is going on, right? We should notice when some group of persons in the sway of some, idea, they're all in the ship together, right? Starts yelling and pointing fingers, and their argument is either broken or malignant, right? And a lot of the time, the most malignant ideas signal as the most heroic. So it's weird. You could say, well, ideas don't signal, humans do. And I wouldn't necessarily fight you about that. I'm not trying to be too picky about the language here. But the demographic little populations, they do a bunch of signaling behavior. And the ones who go about signaling that there's some specific thing really hard usually aren't that thing. And what I mean is, heroes don't signal about being heroes. They just don't do that. They're too busy being heroes to be signaling about it. Part of what's going on here is that there's a sun pool, and the sun pool these fish are hitchhiking on the heat gradient. They're metabolically hitchhiking on the heat gradient to produce energy more easily, less expensively, and more effectively by simply making use of the fact that there's a sun pool. But when a predator shows up, they start to scatter. They don't really see my phone as a predator, but if I stand up, no, they're still pretty calm. They realize, I'm not really messing with a fish. Which certainly wasn't my intention. Now, people who are extremely good architects, some of them signal that they're good architects. Others just become architects who are so profoundly skillful that everybody wants them. They don't go around signaling about being skillful anymore. But my point is just that when you see these little blooms of ideologies and concerns and agendas in the common populations, there's a lot of ironic signaling. And the signaling like we're the heroes is a weird, almost trollish, like bordering on trolling kind of signal that I generally mistrust. Again, guidelines are better than rules, right? But the heroes don't advertise. We're the real Americans. Same problem. Once people start putting on badges that tell you what Navy they belong to, you might want to be concerned about why they're in vehicles in the first place. It's not always true, but... So I've just been thinking about the relationships, really the relationship between my experience of vehicles that I've employed to get me sort of up the ladder, right, to a position where I can see better, where I've got a better shot at acting and understanding things intelligently, and hopefully where I have a better shot at cooperating with like-minded others. And in the modern situation, that can be difficult. The place that I probably belong, I mean, it's hard to say. I was kind of made for academia in a way, but academia is an array of falsified contexts, so we need sort of like the open source version of we learn together with and for each other or something like this, yeah? And it'd be great for us to establish a context like that, or an array, a bunch of different contexts that have this kind of purpose. And we should see through the metaphor of the vehicle too, right? We should realize relationships aren't journeys. A journey is a metaphor that has some functional applicability, but we don't want to exchange it for the incredibly diverse, astonishingly mysterious actual experience of being alive, right? We don't want to think like my body is like a car. It's not like a car. Whatever it is, again, there are places where the frameworks are that we are commonly inclined, that we've subscribed to, we pick them up. There are places where these frameworks are useful, and places where we need to set them down and walk in awareness and perhaps in reverence and adoration of something so mysterious that our intellect will never have the right frame for, with something our intellect will never put in the museum of knowledge, because the relationship will remain alive and vital, and it will prevail over every attempt to tokenize or represent it. And these are my favorite kinds of experiences in relations. And they're most of, for me, what it actually means to be human. So when we're doing a lot of other stuff, I feel a bit confused, and I think the situation is tragic. Now, of course, who do I mean by we? But yeah, you all know. When the humans in general, when the people in my society, when people I'm exposed to on the internet, there's this race to lower the bar, right? Keep that bar low so everyone can play. That's not my kind of game. I'd rather bring everybody up to the highest bar we can get to together and start there, and then maybe repeat that process. Much more interested in a game like that myself. But yeah, we can sometimes, depending on what's going on, we should be compassionate with people who are different from us, and just realize, like, not everybody's on the same, they're not starting with the same assets, right? They're not starting with the same gifts. They each have unique gifts and vulnerabilities, and those get warped and twisted by the contexts and cultures we're exposed to, unless we assemble contexts and cultures together that resist that inclination, which is what I say is a good thing to do. Anytime, any way we can. Every time, in every way we can. As humans, we most often derive our sense of opportunity and threat and role and relation from the context as we read it. So that, for example, in here in the park, people are much friendlier than they are outside the park. Because their role changes when the context changes. And in that sense, our capacity to develop contexts that are creative and playful and intelligent and noble, that's the capacity we need to be paying the most developmental attention to as societies and as people who come together for the sake of doing so. That's the thing, that's the technology that we need. We need the technology that helps us to develop societies intelligent enough to survive the physical technologies our representational cultures have so lethally popularized and made everywhere available. So this is part of my dream. We have words for phenomenon like this. And that guy with his head sticking up is a sentry. And as I'm walking toward them, other sentries will be awakened. But those males with their heads up, right? They are evaluating the safety for the group. And because the group can distribute the unique gifts and skills and potentials of each of its members, everybody does a little less work and gets a lot more benefit. And this is what I meant by everybody's on a different level. That doesn't mean we can't include them, right? My fingers aren't all the same length. The hand is very useful with shorter finger here, right? This isn't the king. It's very difficult to form really good vehicles or frameworks or perspectives on one's own unless one has long experience at doing so. It's also very difficult to form or adopt a good vehicle from within a crisis when we are isolated or injured or sick or frightened. As many people who I know and have loved are and have been. So we kind of need each other, right? But even in our own personal walk in the world, we will build our little ship, and we will set about constructing the compass, and we will be compelled by the readings we take from it. If only we could learn to do this in ways that were dependable and had real integrity and were deeply trustworthy. I would love that. But we are capable of doing something similar with small groups of people over short periods of time, and that gives me hope that we can do it on a societal level over long periods of time. My reflections on this topic are wildly incomplete. I've just been compelled by having it kind of broiling in the back of my mind for a few days, so I wanted to make a relatively brief video. And hopefully there's something juicy in there for someone who will come across it. Even though sometimes I'm really just trying to organize my own thoughts by improvising around them and seeing where it goes. So thank you for joining me and spending time with me and thinking together with me. May the vehicles you find serve you well and take you far. Bye-bye for now.